Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor. I guess that's it for this. And this is part of an ongoing series of Ask Me Anything writing questions. And today's question comes from Artex98. And they say, how much research do you do before you finish plotting? Has it happened to you that you wanted to write about X and started researching and then found out that X is actually boring or not fruitful enough to write a whole book about? Has in-depth research ever made you write the novel completely differently than you originally planned? So, how much research do you do before you finish plotting? Well, as is often the case with these things, it varies quite a bit. It depends on the project. It depends on whether the project is under contract and I have a specific timeline for completion. It depends whether I am submitting an outline to a publisher to get them to approve the larger thing or just to sort of show them what I'm doing. So, my general approach in most situations is to do a fair amount of plotting in advance, and that does require me to do a lot of research simultaneously, especially built around like the big plot points, right? I've written, especially when I was starting out, I wrote a lot of archaeological mysteries and thrillers, and they often hinged on cool things I had found or was in the process of finding, and that shaped the larger story. So in that case, absolutely, I was doing research right at the beginning. But research is kind of something that goes throughout a project, right? I mean, yes, you need to do research to establish the big building blocks of your story to make sure that they work. But then when you're actually writing it, you find yourself constantly needing to know certain key things, right? Such and such a character is in these woods, which means what? What kind of trees are there in that area? What kind of birds are they likely to see, or animals, or whatever, right? I mean, what particular geographical features? Or if I go into this town, what restaurants am I going to see? And I don't mean to sort of accurately identify every single thing so that people who go to those places and know those things will be able to recognize it and check it. But it's about grounding the story in a sense of, in this case, place, right? And I am not going to know that stuff before I start writing. I'm not going to be alert to those kind of details, no matter how much research I've done before. I just won't know what I need until I get into that scene and I start writing it, and I'm like, okay, we're driving along this road, and what is my character going to be thinking about? What are they going to be looking at? And that will frequently require, maybe if it's not set in a contemporary period where I can just sort of pull up maps and stuff about a certain area, maybe it's set in the past, maybe it's set in a different era entirely, or maybe it's a fantasy world and I just have to nail down my sense of what that world is like, how its economy is structured, what its level of technology is, and all those kind of things. So that kind of research, I think, is ongoing. There's a lot of building block stuff early on, and then the sort of small stuff you need to know. And as I say, it varies depending on how the project is coming together. Right now, I'm writing a book, I think, which is not under contract. Nobody knows anything about it. And I have a macro story. I know who my main characters are. I know where it's taking place. I know the core plot ideas, the building blocks of the story, but I don't really know how the story progresses. I don't have a clear sense of what it's going to be or how it's going to resolve. And that's because this is a project that I'm just working on for myself. As I say, it's not under contract, and I'm allowing myself to be a bit more flexible in terms of genre. A lot of what I produce is quite specific. This is a sci-fi adventure. This is a young adult fantasy. This is a mystery. And as soon as you say those things, certain expectations immediately come to mind, and I need to make sure that the story is going to fit them. So plotting it in those, when you have a clear sense of genre, is, I think, both more necessary and more useful. In this case, I'm kind of letting the story evolve as it goes. And that means that there's a lot that I haven't done research on, and I'm having to do it as I go. I know where this is set. So it's a place that I have been to, but it's not a place that I live, so I can't simply go back there. It's in another country. So I'm having to do online research and reading books about that particular area. Books are generally better than much of what you find online in terms of giving you good information, and looking at a lot of pictures and so on. But I am running into things that I don't know how to factor in. Plot points, like I need to know how much can I give away? I need to know what happens when people die in this particular area. Literally what happens. How it gets reported. What happens to the body? Who moves the body? Where does the body go in terms of official buildings? Does it go to a hospital? Does it go to a coroner's office? Does it go to the police department? How are these things different depending on whether a doctor on site has deemed the case suspicious or not? So there's a series of protocols that I just don't know. And finding this stuff out can be quite difficult. Plus, it's a great way to get your search history flagged. So in this case, I've actually written to a coroner's office to ask specific questions about how certain things are processed. And hopefully they will respond and give me stuff that I can use. But this is the kind of information that there's no way I would have thought about this before I got into the story, right? I'm not the sort of Jeffrey Deaver type writer who does a 200-page outline for a 400-page novel. That's not what I'm doing. I am, to a certain extent, building the story as I go. So a lot of this research is stuff that I just didn't know that I was going to need. And it is quite possible, this comes back to the question, that I'm going to run into the facts of actual reality, which will derail my story. Right? In this particular case, for example, I have a plot point in mind which hinges on certain things being true in terms of actual processing of bodies. And if those things turn out not to be true, then I will have to rethink my story. Not because my story will somehow be less literally accurate, but because there's at least the possibility that my story to some people will look stupid if it clearly doesn't go along with things that they know. And it's always amazing to find out things that ordinary people know, right? It makes me very wary about writing about things that I know nothing about, which is why, as I've said before, I avoid horses and boats and a couple of other things that some people are really, really invested in, because these things are sort of lifestyle choices. They get very involved, and if you get them wrong, they're going to be indignant. But it's more than about being irritated by mistakes. It's about being knocked out of the story. And that's the thing. I was talking to friends when I was at JordanCon a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to friends about a TV show called The Residence, which I really enjoyed in lots of ways, but there were a couple of moments. The main character is a detective who is defined almost exclusively in terms of her personal life as a birder, a twitcher, a bird watcher. And I have always been a bird watcher, and there were things that the show did which were wrong. Things that she was doing or saying that were factually inaccurate. And for those moments, it knocked me out of the show. And it annoyed me because her intelligence and her approach to her detective work was supposed to be mirrored in her bird watching expertise. And the fact that there were factual inaccuracies in some of the birdwatching stuff made me take her less seriously. It undermined her as an intelligence. And that is a problem. So you're trying to avoid that kind of thing all the time when you're doing research. You don't want things to knock people out of the story. Every time I read something that is factually wrong, and I know it to be factually wrong, for a split second, I stop trusting the narrator of the story. So yeah, I frequently, so I'm adding a third category to the ones that the questioner raised. You know, the research turns out to be boring, or it's insufficiently fruitful to generate the whole book. Those things absolutely happen all the time, where you're pursuing something that you think is going to be productive, and it turns out that in some ways it isn't. You know, when I'm writing books with Tom, like the Secret Machines books and things like that, they require a lot of research. And again, a lot of that stuff is material that I have to cover in advance, but I'm doing it all the time. And sometimes it's a blind alley. It doesn't take me where I need to go, and I have to abandon it. Sometimes I have to completely rethink certain elements of the story. And this is true when you have plotted something out quite specifically, and it's a danger, right? Because sometimes your publisher has already signed off on it and said, yeah, this sounds great, go ahead, you know, and then you find out that certain things just don't really work, and you have to redirect. And that can mean having to redo your outline so that you don't get stuck, right? In changing elements of the story, the whole thing still works, right? So yeah, so in addition to those two problems, sometimes it's just wrong. It's not just that it's not generative enough, it's just not accurate. So that informs that last question. Has the research completely redirected a book? This happens all the time. All the time. This is always the problem with research. It's not the stuff that you know nothing about that is going to trip you up. Because if you know nothing about it, then you research it like crazy. And when you've written it, you turn it over to people who know that subject better than you do. And they can look at it and say, yes, you've got this right. No, you've not got it right. Because you know that this is not part of your experience or knowledge base. The stuff that trips you up is the stuff that you don't know you don't know. That's a terrible sentence, but you know what I mean, right? It's the stuff that you kind of think you understand, and you commit to it, and then after the fact, somebody will point out and say, this is completely wrong. None of this makes sense, right? Now, of course, you're writing fiction, or at least I am. I'm writing fiction. And it's different from when I'm doing scholarly work where everything has to be accurate, absolutely accurate. In fiction, you've got some leeway. The problem, as I've said, is that when you start making mistakes, people notice it. How many errors will you forgive an author before you stop trusting them as a storyteller, before you stop believing in the story, and before you eventually give up on the book and stop reading? Those are big questions, because I think that not believing in the story immediately lowers the stakes. Maybe you're enjoying it enough to keep going. You know, you're watching a gunfight in a TV show, and people are emptying entire magazines from automatic weapons, and no one gets hit, right? Or they get a graze in the shoulder from which they magically recover in a matter of seconds. Like, okay, we know that this is the convention of TV, but at what point do you say, okay, this is not real? And because it's not real, when we go into the next combat sequence, I'm less invested. I'm less anxious for the heroes. I'm less concerned that things are going to go badly, because the track record of the show has shown me that they are not really engaged in actual reality at all. They're looking to create lots of dynamism and bangs and flashes and such. But we're not really worried about what firearms actually do to people. This is a persistent problem on American television. But you see what I mean? These are the issues that I think, as a writer, you know, the last thing you want is a boring fight scene. But fight scenes become boring if people stop believing that your story is anchored in any version of reality. So the short answer is, yeah, books often come out quite different from what you think they're going to be based on your initial expectations, because as you dig into the subject, as you are forced to explore more to make sure that you're getting things right, you find that stuff is not behaving in the way that you thought it would, and it takes the story in different directions. To me, that's not a problem. I mean, it can be time consuming and it can force you to redo stuff, but it's not of itself a problem. It's part of the natural, organic process of writing. You're always going to make mistakes. Hopefully, they're the kind of mistakes that only very specialist people will notice, and they are the kind of mistakes that don't massively affect your story, and you don't make enough of those kind of mistakes for them to accumulate. Because I think that's the thing when you're doing research. How many things do I have to get wrong before I lose you? That's the question. Having said all that, I don't think you should be overly intimidated by research and by correctness, by getting your story absolutely right. Obviously, you're going to try to do that. But you can't let these things stop you from actually writing the book unless the research demonstrates that your core plot is nonsense. And then obviously you're going to have to rethink. But the little stuff should always be in service of your story. And if there are things you don't know, you can usually find a way to avoid them. If you don't know what the birds are in those particular forests, then don't talk about the birds. Or just leave it as, oh, sort of, there's a sound of birds in the trees, whatever. Do I need to tell you exactly what they are if I really don't know and have no way of finding out? No, I would say not. The story is paramount. That's what people are there to read. Character work is crucial. Factual inaccuracies are going to creep in occasionally. What I would absolutely say is that you can't let the research become an end in itself. This is like world building, right? When fantasy writers do this all the time. And I've had students come in, it's like, I've got binders of world building stuff. And I'm like, what are you doing? What's the story? It's like, well, it's about this civilization, which, is premised under 3 moons and the technologies. And I'm like, I don't care. What's the story? Everything else is in service of story. And maybe it has a particular effect on the story, and maybe it's just background. But what you can't do is spend all your life doing research and accumulating more and more and more stuff. A, it slows you down in terms of the writing, and it throws your perspective off. B, it provides huge amounts of data and information which you are going to be tempted to include in the story, whether the story needs it or not. And that's a bad idea. And we've talked before about the perils of the info dump or the archival perspective on history and something that you see particularly in fantasy, but also in sci-fi and various other things. People who I have done all this research and God damn it, I'm going to use it. I'm going to put it in whether you want to read it or not. And there is nothing that will kill a story dead than the sudden appearance of the author over your shoulder saying, let me tell you something else that I think is really interesting about early 19th century London or whatever. It has to be in service of the story. So yes, research is really important, but it should not stop you from writing the book. You can always go back and fix stuff later on. And if, there's a huge problem, then you'll have to figure out the huge problem. Research is a good servant and a bad master. If it takes over the project, then you can spend the rest of your life compiling more and more bits of stuff. You don't want to do that. Story is king, and character is king of story. The end. All right, that's it. I will leave it at that. But please feel free to keep sending in the questions. And those questions can go in the comments on here, or you can email me through my website. And as ever, like, comment, subscribe, check out my Patreon page. As I always say, my Patreon page is what keeps this channel going because the channel is otherwise not monetized. Check out my books, and then you can tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to research. And check out my little Dashery store. for shirts and stuff like that. You get extra points if you can tell me what play this is a reference to. And that's all. I will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.